Hi, everybody. So this is a great event. We have Bob Suettinger speaking to us about his new book on Yaobang. So I want to introduce Bob a little bit. Which degree did you get? I've asked you
Master's
this.
here.
In poli-sci.
In comparative politics.
So in 1970.
75 is when I was finally granted.
So Bob got the MA degree in poli-sci here in 1975. So I'm hearing, and so I was here then. I came here in 1971. So Bob was one of the first group of students that I interacted with. I want to say one of my first students, but I'm afraid if I say that, he's going to contradict me. And then after that, he went into, you correct me if I get something wrong, but he went into the CIA and as a China analyst and had a very, very distinguished career and rose up to the level of National Intelligence Officer for East Asia and served in the National Security Council when Clinton was president. And so now he's retired, which I think is very lazy behavior on the part of somebody who was my student. But he has spent a lot of recent time doing this research that is not easy to do on the great Chinese leader Hu Yaobang. And he's now finally come out with this great book from Harvard University Press, which is, very prestigious press for things like this. So we're lucky to have him here to introduce the book and to persuade you all to shell out money to buy the book. So for people who are online, there's a Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. So that's where you want to enter those questions, and I will, when Bob's done talking and we do Q&A, then I'll have a look at the Q&A and convey some of those questions to him. So thank you for coming, and let's hear what you found out.
Thank you, Andy. Well, thanks to all of you for showing up on this great day. Especially thanks to Julie Kwan and Susan Anthony, who helped set this up, and especially to my lauscher and good friend of 50 years, Andy Nathan. Thank you. More than 50 years have passed since I first set foot on the Columbia campus. I was fresh out of uniform, 2 weeks out of Long Binh and Cu Chi in Vietnam, still looked more like a soldier than a student. I rented on the east side because I'd lived with rats and roaches for a year and I didn't want to do it anymore. I took the subway to Columbia, got pretty well lost on an urban campus, and I found myself barricaded from Kent Hall by student demonstrators who had sort of put their hands on the ground and locked arms and said, "You can't go in." And I said, "Oh, yes, I can." And I said, "You can try to stop me, but I promise you, you won't succeed." And I had virtually no hair. I have no hair now, but I'd waited a year, 2 years to come to Columbia, and I wasn't going to wait any longer to start classes. So I did. I got past them, studied with Martin Wilbur, Loretta Pond, Roger Yue, Mike Oxenberg, and eventually Andy Nathan. And that summer, I got a job as an intern at the Central Intelligence Agency through Mike Oxenberg, who got a lot of friends there. In my second year here, Mike Oxenberg left Columbia for the University of Michigan. He arranged a scholarship for me to follow him out there, but I declined it. I got married instead and followed my wife out to Hong Kong and Malaysia, where I spent 2 years. I worked on a master's thesis for Andy during that period. And after I finished it, I decided academic prospects didn't look so hot. So I joined the CIA and terminated my graduate education with a master's degree in comparative politics. So this is still a bit of a homecoming for me. And he's probably a bit annoyed that I didn't pursue a PhD, but I had an interesting career in the CIA, nearly all of it working on China issues. So now I'm coming back to my roots, carrying the fruit of 10 years of research and writing. It's called The Conscience of the Party, Yaobang, China's Communist Reformer. The Conscience of the Party is in fact a prequel to the book I wrote at Brookings in 2004, which was called Beyond Tiananmen, The Politics of U.S.-China Relations, from 1989 to 2000. Both books were supported by the Smith-Richardson Foundation. Both books are historical in intent, chronological in format. Both have political theoretical implications and observations, but neither one of them would probably pass muster in a modern poli-sci course. Both are research heavy and both were overly long first drafts. It seems my CIA training in writing brief, concise papers for busy senior policymakers was discarded almost immediately upon my leaving the agency headquarters. I had been chief of the domestic policy branch of the China division of the Directorate of Intelligence during most of Hu Yaobang's career as CCP chairman and general secretary, and we paid a lot of attention to his rise and fall, but I did not use those papers, although I subsequently found most of them in the FOIA section of the agency's website. I didn't use them as source material because I didn't want them to kind of pollute my research. I didn't want to have my conclusions all set out before I even went about it. I covered Hu Yaobang's final few months as general secretary in Beyond Tiananmen, but I didn't pay much attention to his personality, his politics, his attitudes, his associates, his enemies, successes, and failures. I tried to make up for that in this book, which is based almost entirely on open source material in the Chinese language, published in the PRC and also particularly in Hong Kong. For 16 years after his death in April 1989, until his 90th birthday in 2005, Hu Yaobang was a non-person. You could not mention his name in the Chinese media. There were no books about him. There were no commemorations, no photos, no historical anecdotes, no family remembrances, nothing. Only after the old cadre who had brought about his downfall in 1987 had themselves gone to see Marx, as they put it, and after Jiang Zemin had reluctantly let go of his power, as did Hu's story reemerge in 2005. Hu Jintao, who was not a relation but was a subordinate to Hu Yaobang from their days in the Communist Youth League, acquiesced in the slow motion rehabilitation, but all the heavy lifting was done by Hu Yaobang's loyal staff, subordinates, and family members who wrote books, articles, and especially after 2006, contributed to an online network devoted to contemporary history, including CCP history. Yanhong Chunqiu was a magazine at that time. It had been established in 1991, I believe, by an old general. It was the banner publication for anybody interested in CCP history, or any history for that matter. It was a magnificent magazine. And it was in reading those articles that I felt like I was standing on the shoulders of giants. Men like Li Rui, Shen Zhihua, who was just down in Washington, Han Gang, Wang Haiguang, Xu Qingchuan, Shan Baoxiang, Zhang Liqun, three of Hu's children, and especially Gao Hua, who was a remarkable historian who died much too early. Many of these people shared also just one anecdote the first time and only time they met Hu Yaobang, and they published it someplace or another. And it was always interesting because they were so struck by his personality and what kind of a leader he seemed to be. And the grieving for Hu Yaobang in 1989 was genuine. This was no weeping in front of Mao's casket. This was the real thing. So there was an ocean of material and open source works in the Chinese language, and I was sort of overwhelmed by it because at this point I was just a foreign devil reading a foreign language, and I didn't start reading that language till I was 21. So I had a lot of making up to do. So I want to cover 4 issues today. First one is who was Hu Yaobang? And this isn't the old baseball routine. This is a question, who was this guy? So my version of the story of Hu Yaobang's life is this. Born and raised in a Hakka peasant family in eastern Hunan, one of 4 children of 12 who survived to adulthood, just under 5 feet tall, just over 100 pounds, very heavy Hunan accent, high squeaky voice. He walked 12 miles to and from elementary school, but he was brilliant. He started learning characters when he was 3, and his uncle who named him, he never changed his name, by the way. His name was given to him by a second uncle, and it just happened to be, to have a sort of a patriotic connotation to it, so he kept it. He didn't go to a fancy school, didn't go to military school, didn't go to France. He studied in a small school that he had to walk to about 12 kilometers away. But his education was cut short by warlord forays through Hunan province, which was central in the 20s, when the Chinese Revolution was just beginning to blow out. And everybody that wanted to go north went through Hunan. Everybody who wanted to attack south went through Hunan. And so it was a very difficult place to get an education. So at the age of 14, Hu Yaobang became a revolutionary. His family had been involved in rural affairs. Mao's teachings had certainly gotten into Hunan. Mao was from Hunan, so and not from that far away. But he was too small to be a soldier, so he became an agitprop specialist, agitation propaganda specialist, who gravitated toward the Youth League. He went on the Long March in 1934, and he was sick most of the way, or wounded, or somehow or another almost. He shouldn't, by all stretches of the imagination, he shouldn't have made it. But a couple of his old friends put him on a horse for a while, and he managed to make it all the way to Yan'an in 1935. And he helped Mao there. Mao discovered him because he spoke a Hunan accent the first time he talked to him. And he said, "Oh, just a little guy." But he was very fond of Hu because Hu was, as I say, a very good student, sat right up at the front when Mao was giving his lectures. And he became an acolyte of Mao. And he was also involved in writing pamphlets and in weeding out potential Kuomintang spies in the various schools in Yan'an. There was a lot of suspicion at that time at Kangda. And he worked in the Central Military Commission because Mao wanted him to. He worked with a man named Ye Jianying, who was one of Mao's senior generals, one of his most talented negotiators, and a man who was also Hakka, and he and Hu Yaobang got along very well. After the Japanese surrender, and the CCP's part in the anti-Japanese war was a relatively minor one, and Mao has in fact thanked Japan for attacking China on several occasions because it diverted the Kuomintang from attacking the communist enclave in Yan'an. Hu Yaobang volunteered to go to the North China Field Army, where he was a senior political commissar under Xu Xiangqian, Nie Rongzhen, and Peng Dehuai, participating in several very high casualty battles, including the bloodbath at Taiyuan, where 43,000 CCP soldiers lost their lives in a battle that took several days and had to be rejoined again several months later. Eventually, he ended up in Sichuan as a sub-provincial administrator in North Sichuan under the control and the direction of Deng Xiaoping. And that was the first time he'd met him. Hu Yaobang was not a protege of Deng, and although they regularly played contract bridge together, they were not friends. And most of the time, because they had completely different styles of play, they weren't even partners. Hu Yaobang had a rather flamboyant way of playing bridge, doubling and tripling and all the rest of that stuff, whereas Deng Xiaoping was straight by the book. I got this hand, we're bidding 2 clubs. And so he would rather have Hu Yaobang sitting across the table, not across the table from him, but alongside, because he often beat him. In 1952, they were both transferred to Beijing to join the new government. Hu Yaobang was not happy when Mao Zedong decided that he wanted him to be the head of the Communist Youth League. He'd been doing that for the last decade, and he was tired of it. He was hoping to become Minister of Construction. But Mao said, "No, you're going to be my man in the Youth League." And Hu Yaobang said, "Okay, that's what I'll do." He did that job successfully for the next 10 years. And he did it very well. He trained a cadre of people to learn how to train, organize, do all kinds of different work. The Youth League it about tripled in size during the period in the first few years that Hu was there, simply because he was such a terrific organizer. He knew how to get large groups to work together and to work successfully. But he also saw at close hand, because he joined the Central Committee in 1956, he saw the terrible decisions that were being made by Mao and his new government. Great leap forward, 30 million dead at least, perhaps twice that number. Personnel politics became highly personnel, very damaging, highly toxic. Hu Yaobang wanted to get out of Beijing because it was getting really nasty. He was having all kinds of trouble with keeping up with politics that he really didn't agree with. So he asked for an assignment. They gave him Hunan, where he went to Shanghai Prefecture and was a deputy to an interesting fellow from Shanxi province named Hua Guofeng. Hua Guofeng was the guy who who took care of Mao's home village. But Xiangtan had been hard hit by the Great Leap, and Hu Yaobang was determined and dedicated to restoring agriculture there, and that was what he considered to be his main goal. Well, Hunan had already at that point fallen into highly difficult factional fighting, and the first secretary of the province and the second secretary weren't getting along. Nobody knew who Mao favored, and Hu Yaobang was being called back to do youth league work again, so he went back to Beijing. He was supposed to be there for 2, he was only there for a year. In 1964, an opening came up in Shanxi province, which is where Yan'an is, and Xi'an and so forth. And so he went there and was assigned as first secretary in Shanxi and as third secretary of the Northwest Regional Bureau under a fellow named Liu Lantao. Liu Lantao was an acolyte of Liu Shaoqi. And so when Hu Yaobang showed there, saying, not boasting about, but pretending and showing people that he was an acolyte of Mao Zedong, Liu Lantao immediately took umbrage at him and didn't like him. So their relationship was pretty much bad from the outset. And it got worse almost instantly. Hu Yaobang had to go back for some party meetings in Beijing, but once he got there, he went on an inspection tour of Shanxi province. And he started telling people that they needed to work harder on agriculture. And he told Liu Lantao that he needed to stop arresting people, which is what he was doing, like 300 a day in Shanxi. He said, we need more education. We need more industry. Because they had no industry in Shanxi. And Shanxi was desperately poor in 1935 when they got there, and it was still desperately poor in 1964 when Hu Yaobang said, we need to fix this. Unfortunately, they followed his every move, and Liu Lantao called him back less than a week into his tour of the province and said, you've made some serious political mistakes. You need to come back to Xi'an. So beginning in January 1965, Hu Yaobang was again under interrogation, incarceration, daily struggle sessions, where he was the butt of everybody's attacks. And he had friends out there, but they didn't stick by him, and most of the rest of them deserted him. Some of his old friends from Hunan and elsewhere basically said, we're cutting ties with that guy. He's dead meat. We don't want to have anything to do with him. His health failed him almost completely. He acquired a disease that I can't even remember how to say, but it was a swelling of nerves in his back, and it basically knocked him out. And so they had to let up on him, but they didn't let up on him. They said they had a thing called a gentile. A gentile is where you make a confession, and then they all vote on it as to whether or not they accept it. If they didn't like your wording in this place, they'd vote no. And so he went through approximately 11 or 12 different gentiles over a period of several months, and he was exhausted. He was sick. He was not able to answer his accusers. And they brought in thousands, literally thousands of cadre in this huge auditorium, and they screamed at the top of their voices at him. And he collapsed, basically. In June of 1965, an airplane landed with an interesting man aboard it named Ye Jianying. And he brought with him a couple of other interesting persons. And they said, you're coming back to Beijing with us. And Hu said, no, I've got to finish this. And Ye Jianying basically said, you're too small for this. You didn't have enough meals when you were a kid. You can't win here. We know that. Come back with us. And he did. He was tired, dispirited. They sent him out to Beidaihe for a while. But it became clear to him fairly quickly that the person that had brought him back was Mao Zedong. But unfortunately for him, he came back right at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. He was recuperating, but when the Cultural Revolution began, the China Youth League got immediately sucked into it for sending teams out to the elementary schools. And Mao didn't like that. He came back from Wuhan after swimming in the Yangtze River in July of 1965. And then he called, sort of at the snap of his fingers, a Central Committee meeting at which he criticized Hu Yaobang for allowing the China Youth League to go off to the elementary schools where they were a dismal failure. By this point, the Cultural Revolution was beginning to blow out of control. Beatings were beginning in all of the schools. Deaths were beginning to occur. And the government was really sort of falling into disarray because nobody knew what Mao wanted. Whether Mao knew what he wanted or not is immaterial because he just kept the Cultural Revolution going. It was disorganized. It was inchoate. Hu Yaobang was one of the first of the Central Committee members to be incarcerated. Mao said Hu Yaobang made a serious mistake and he should be punished. That night, the Red Guards came for him, took him out of his home, took him back to CYL headquarters near Tiananmen Square, and they put him in a cowshed, what was called a Niupang. And there he was interrogated every day, and he was not allowed to go home. His family was not allowed to see him, and it was just they began to beat him in late 1966, and in some cases, they threw garbage at him, and at one point, when Mao was meeting with Red Guards in Tiananmen Square, they were beating the hell out of Hu Yaobang back in the CYL, and he was beaten probably 10 or 12 times in late 1966, often with belts, often with wooden staves, often until his face was bloody. They shaved his head. They did everything to him but kill him, and he was a tough guy. His health wasn't good, but he was 100 pounds, 5 feet tall. There wasn't much of him to hit. So he refused to knuckle under. And then suddenly Mao changed his mind. He wanted to have the final plenum of the 8th Congress, which started in 1956, be the one that threw Liu Shaoqi out of the party. And he had already basically purged most of the Central Committee at that point. So they needed to call on the sort of the alternates. So Mao said, "How about Hu Yaobang? He grew up as a young revolutionary child. Let's bring him." So they brought him to the 8th. They literally came to the Niupang, picked him up, took him to the Jiangxi, not Jiangxi Hotel,
no, I know.
Jingxi Hotel.
Thank you.
And there he shows up in his prison clothes, and they said, "Go home, get dressed, say hello to your kids, and then come back to the plenum." But he knew what he had to do, which was when the resolution came up, throwing Liu Shaoqi out of the party for life, criticizing him as a scab, traitor, all the rest of that stuff. He raised his hand, and he always regretted it thereafter because he knew, as did everybody else, that Liu Shaoqi was not guilty. But he had some hope of becoming a member of the 9th Central Committee, but he refused to knuckle under to Kangshan or to Jiangqing, and they voted him out. So he didn't go to the 9th Central Committee. He went to the meeting, but then two weeks later, he was in a labor camp in Henan province, where he spent the next 2 years, and literally hard labor. They had nothing there. This is a land of mud and mosquitoes. And he and the entire Youth League senior leadership were all sent down there to do hard labor. Hard labor they did. He got ill again and had to have some surgery, but they sent him back. And he didn't actually get out until the Lin Biao incident in 1971, when Lin Biao crashed his plane in the Mongolian desert. That's in the book if you want to talk about it some other time. It's an interesting incident. So Hu Yaobang didn't have a job for another 3 years after he got back. He just sort of sat in his house and he read old books, read new books, and thought about what had happened to him. And he knew that all of the mistreatment that he had received had the approval of Mao Zedong. He knew that all the crazy ideas that had floated about during the Cultural Revolution came from Mao Zedong. And he didn't rebel at that point in time, but he kind of had some serious second thoughts about what he was going to do. But before he had any chance to do that, Deng Xiaoping was still at that point under house arrest. And Mao brought him back in 1975 to do some, because the government was a shambles. And he said, all right, I want you to fix this. Ye Jianying recommended Hu Yaobang to be one of his assistants. And Hu Yaobang was chosen to head the China Academy of Science, and to bring in a new leadership and to reopen something like, of the 120 laboratories that belonged to the Chinese Academy of Sciences, 75 of them had been closed, and most of the rest of them were run by military. So he was given the responsibility for opening that up, and he started that fairly actively. And he went out and gave lectures, and they were fiery lectures. And he said, look, you know, your Cultural Revolution people didn't know anything about science. I don't know anything about science either, but I'm going to learn, and you're going to learn with me. And so they started putting new people in positions, rewriting guidelines and so forth. And Mao got hold of it, got wind of it, and sort of the Gang of Four, and who was saddled with an unfortunate deputy who would be his bane for the rest of his life, a man named Hu Jiaomu, who was a biganza. He was one of the scribes for the Central Committee. And Hu Jiaomu said, you know, this article is good, and Deng approved it. He said, but it needs some more quotes from the chairman. So he went through his books and got some chosen quotes, choice quotes from Mao Zedong, and they put it in the article. And Hu Yaobang thought, well, that's probably not going to work out right. He was right, because Mao looked at those quotes and he didn't recognize one of them. And he said, I never said that. So, you know, that was just the kind of the opening shot for the race to see who could say all the worst things about Deng Xiaoping, Hu Yaobang, and the other 5 or 6 people that were helping him. So they all went down again. Hu Yaobang was not arrested, not beaten at this point, but they sent him up to one of the Academy of Sciences laboratories in the Northeast. On his way back to Beijing, the Tangshan earthquake took place in 1976. So he had to go back, and eventually got home, and then Mao, of course, died in 1976, and the Gang of Four was purged shortly after that by Hua Guofeng and Ye Jianying, whose old friends and supporters. So Ye Jianying sent word to Hu Yaobang at his home saying, look forward to getting a new job. Well, it didn't quite happen that way. But he did send Ye a proposal for what should be done to help China resurge into its old, how can we fix this mess? And he sent him some good advice that's still available all over China. And he said, basically, stop criticizing Deng, 1. 2, reverse all of the bad verdicts on everybody who was arrested during the Cultural Revolution and before. And 3, start growing things again. Start producing things again, and the people will be happy. Ye Jianying liked that, Hua Guofeng liked it, Deng Xiaoping liked it. So Hu Yaobang was brought back to the Central Party School as kind of the guy in charge. So what did Hu Yaobang do? What were the keys to his success? He started an intellectual journal at the Central Party School, and he populated it with Marxist intellectuals, and they basically started looking at the party's guiding lines that were being considered at the Central Committee meetings, and they said you can't say continue the revolution. Said we finished the revolution. You can't use that term anymore. They found all kinds of faults, and of course there was a huge uproar about it. But Hu Yaobang stuck to his guns. Ye Jianying approved it. Hua Guofeng was not so sure of what he wanted to do, and Deng Xiaoping didn't understand what they were talking about. But he was very good at organizing things. One of the first targets of his people was that they wanted to fix was fixing all these bad verdicts, and they went to the organization department, which is the personnel department of the Central Committee, and they said, look, the guy that's in charge of that now is a former soldier of Lin Biao's. He was an acolyte of Kang Sheng, who was the worst thing that ever happened to the Chinese Revolution. So let's get him out and put Hu Yaobang in, which they did. Hu Yaobang immediately reorganized the organization department, And within the course of a year, he reversed verdicts on somewhere in the neighborhood of 550,000 cadres who had been purged during the Cultural Revolution, including almost 4 million of their family members, who, of course, because their main breadwinner was in disgrace, the family was in disgrace too. They couldn't get jobs, they couldn't go to schools. There weren't any schools to go to, but so he basically just said, get this done. He read thousands of letters on his own, and the most important thing that he probably did, and he doesn't get credit for it, in 1978, he was still head of the organization department, and the party was thinking about holding its 11th plenum. Third plenum of the 11th Central Committee, which of course has been a very famous plenum because it was the one where Deng Xiaoping said, we're not going to pursue the revolution anymore. We're going to grow things. We're going to produce things. We want to improve people's livelihood, 4 modernizations. And Hu Yaobang said, well, there's some other things that need to be taken care of at the same time. And so he brought a lot of the material that he was collecting in the organization department on hundreds and hundreds of cadres who still had not regained their positions, who were still in jail, who were still in disgrace. And he put them before another old gentleman named Chen Yun. Chen Yun was Deng's superior in terms of cadre rank. He outranked Deng. And they wanted to bring him back too, although Mao had fired him as well. And they did. And he said, these are what we're going to work on first. And they did. And in the November work conference before the plenum, they brought all these people back out. And as a reward for Hu Yaobang brought all the material that they needed. He had all the files. So he said, you need to get this guy and this guy and that guy and rehabilitate him. So many of these cadre were grateful to him for his organizational skills. So they said, we want you to be Secretary General, not General Secretary, Secretary General of the party and head of the propaganda department. He couldn't have had a worse set of jobs laid on him if he'd asked for it, because those were the most divided and still fighting the Cultural Revolution in the propaganda department. So they gave him to Hu Yaobang, and not surprisingly, he flubbed him, and fairly early and fairly spectacularly, in 1979, because Hu Yaobang wanted very badly to fix Mao's ideology, because he knew that was the main problem. So he brought people together at the party school. He said, let's study this. Let's talk about that. He ran campaigns. He ran articles in the newspapers. He ran all kinds of things to get people to think about, why did the Cultural Revolution last 10 years? Who started it? What was the reason for it? And why did the Gang of Four come up from Shanghai and make such a mess of things? And people were answering those questions fairly honestly, and there began to be an undercurrent of anti-Maoism in some of the universities. And Hu Yaobang decided at Ye Jianying's suggestion that they would have a major meeting on propaganda, which they did in 1979. And it was, we still can't get the documents from that because it was a free-for-all. Mao Zedong's reputation took a huge beating because all these old intellectuals came out and they said, that man was at fault for everything that went wrong in China since 1964. And they wrote articles and they screamed where was Deng Xiaoping at this point? He was in the United States, visiting with Jimmy Carter and trying to get Carter's support for the Vietnam War. So he didn't want to be bothered with that, but Hu Qiaomu, who was Deng's writer, said, you won't believe what's going on here. You've got to come back and stop this. Well, he came back at the regular time. And he gave, at the end of it, what was called the Four Uphold speech, which is you've got to uphold the party, Marxism, Leninism, Lao Tzu thought. I think of the other two, but it was basically said dictatorship of the proletariat and the socialist road. That's why he's a professor, not just a spook. And this didn't knock Hu Yaobang out of the box, but it basically took the wind out of his sails. And from that point forward, Hu Yaobang was in a struggle for how the party was going to be run. And Deng Xiaoping, who at that time was, I think, his early 80s, and Chen Yun, who was 82, and Peng Zhen, who was 84, and all these old guys that Hu Yaobang had gotten out of jail came back and were the bane of his existence. Because, even though they were supposedly not supposed to interfere in government politics, they did it anyway. Wang Zhen, Keynes and everything. he was walking around telling people, you gotta do this way, that way, you can't say that. And they were all fiercely loyal to Deng Xiaoping. They were not at all grateful to Hu Yaobang for getting him out of jail. And anytime there was a disagreement, they always supported Deng and Hu Qiaomu. Hu Qiaomu decided he hated Hu Yaobang, and he tried to get him fired. And Hu Yaobang kept bringing up supportive ideas for how to actually do modernization, how to do reform. He began to actually think about what we needed to do to reform the party. First of all, recognize your mistakes. Second, don't make them again. Third, release all those people from prison that you put in jail for breaking those regulations. And fourth, get busy and get down to work. And then he told them, stop hitting each other over the head with things, stop sticking labels, stop arresting people, and let's see what we can do to work together. It was a progressive, not only ideology, but approach to fixing the politics. And Chen Yun tried to have him fired. And Hu Qiaomu was perfectly happy with that. Who saved Hu Yaobang? Ye Jianying, who was in a hospital bed at that point, virtually on his deathbed. But he brought Hu back, and Deng finally said, all right, we'll let him stay. And he also supported Zhao Ziyang at that time. So the Hu Yaobang, Zhao Ziyang, Deng Xiaoping triumvirate was formed during that period and was working fairly well. Hu Yaobang also began to work on personnel issues. And one of the most important ones was guys who are in their 80s, they need to retire. And that was not a welcome message, as you might understand. But he actually managed to hold a couple of important party meetings where he got a third of the Central Committee and a third of the Central Discipline Inspection Commission to retire. He brought about the successful resolution of a party resolution on spiritual civilization, which they'd been arguing about for 2 years. And so he was on a roll, but he was trying to get Deng Xiaoping to retire and Chen Yun to go with him and all the rest of those old guys as well. And they weren't having any of that. And there was a lot of confusion. There was all the old guys were spreading rumors about this and that and the other thing. And they were whispering in Deng's ear. He gave a wonderful interview with a guy named Lu Kang, who was a Hong Kong reporter. And Lu Kang was a sly old dog, and he got Hu Yaobang to say some things he probably shouldn't have said, which all the old guys picked up immediately and started throwing at him in meetings. At any rate, the key event, and this isn't in your history books, was the death of Ye Jianying in October 1986. The second thing that took place at that time was a relatively small-scale student demonstration starting in Shanghai, Suzhou, and some other places. And they were noisy. They weren't violent. Well, they got a little violent when the police started attacking them. But by this time, it was late in the autumn, and it was getting cold in Beijing, and the Beijing universities hadn't started, but they were making noises as if they would. And Deng Xiaoping hated student demonstrations. And he said, these are your fault, Hu Yaobang. You're too liberal. You're suffused with bourgeois liberalization. You got to stop this. You got to stop it in its tracks. You got to take the police out there, and if 1,000 people show up, arrest 1,000. And he gave orders to all of Hu's people, and then he brought the old guys in and said, you guys have to support me on this. This was in late December. There was a demonstration scheduled for January 1st, 1987. A couple thousand students from Beida and Shifan Daxue and Tsinghua marched in almost 0-degree temperatures. They didn't have a lot of energies. Their shouts were barely hearable above the noise, above the wind. When they got down to Tiananmen Square, Hu Yaobang had his friend and former Youth League subordinate, who was the Minister of Public Security, surround the Martyrs Monument with kids, children's corps, and police. And so the students, when they got there, couldn't get in. So what that began, Hu Yaobang finally decided, I'm done. This just isn't going to work. So he resigned. He didn't resign to the Central Committee, he resigned to Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping then organized what was called the Party Life Meeting in mid-January 1987, at which everybody who was a member of the Politburo or the Secretariat or senior members of a couple of the other committees all gathered around, and they basically threw garbage. They didn't throw garbage. They criticized Hu Yaobang, as he put it. They criticized me till I stank. 6 days, half day each of these guys. Everybody had to criticize him, and they did, and it broke him because the last one to criticize him was Zhao Ziyang, and Zhao Ziyang said, "You know, I just don't think I can work with Hu Yaobang. I think if you elders were to disappear or retire or die, you know, I would be no match for him," which is probably true. But I'm frightened of him, and I don't think we can allow him to continue to be general secretary. So they signed a resolution, completely illegal, completely out of the party, out of the party's charter, and they said he's out. We'll leave him on the standing committee, but he's not going to have anything to do. And his health was broken. He basically disappeared into his home for a month, and then he never really came back. He came out and made a visit to Hunan, but he was already ill. Here's a guy that smoked 4 packs a day, and he was beginning to have heart problems. So he wandered around a bit. He tried some calligraphy. His friends came to visit him. They wrote some poetry, but he had no job, and he had no interest, and he had nobody that wanted to listen to him. So he was done. Same thing had been done to Hua Guofeng with Hu Yaobang's help, in fact. But he was completely dispirited. He decided to come back in April of 1989 to attend a meeting on education because he was still a member of the Politburo. He was entitled to do so. And he had a heart attack at that Politburo meeting on April 8th, and he died on the 15th.
How old was he then?
He was 73. So why did he fail? He failed for a number of reasons. He never had any real military support. He never had the kinds, the young people he had, their allegiance and support. But there was a CCP structure of rigid hierarchies that didn't allow him. Hu Yaobang could not call a meeting of the Standing Committee of the Politburo. He was the chairman of the party and the general secretary of the party, but he couldn't call a meeting because Deng Xiaoping and Hu Yaobang outranked him, and they didn't like each other, and they didn't like to come to meetings, so they didn't have one. So when they wanted something done, they gave an order to Hu Yaobang, and he had no. And Zhao Ziyang was in the same boat. So the old boys were in charge, and the structures supported them. The culture of power in the CCP supported them in doing that. Seniority is everything. Discipline is everything. You die, I live. A very highly competitive, nasty atmosphere at the top levels of the party. They didn't like each other, and they often were hard pressed not to show it. It came to a point where they weren't allowed to have meetings amongst themselves unless their secretaries were along with them to take notes on what they said to each other, because they were all afraid that somebody was out to get them, and in many cases somebody was. Deng and Mao believed they were irreplaceable. So Deng had agreed that, oh yeah, I should retire. He actually told reporters that yeah, I'm going to retire, but gee, the problem is that nobody really wants me to retire. The rank and file of the party are very much against my retiring. So I'll stay around until I can persuade them. And of course, Zhao Ziyang was in no position to persuade him. So Chen Yun stepped back 1/2 of a step. Deng stepped back 1/2 of a step, but they signed an actual resolution at the 13th Party Congress in 1987 that all important decisions by the Central Committee will go through Deng Xiaoping. And that came up during the Tiananmen demonstrations because Zhao Ziyang briefed Gorbachev on it when he came to visit. And that didn't win him any friends. Patriarchy, what I say goes. You just simply cannot question somebody's orders. And if he outranks you, you're done. And you've seen this continues to this day. I mean, when Xi Jinping goes out and talks to the people, which isn't very often, you know, he'll stand there and a bunch of them will stand in a semicircle around him and he'll, you know, count off on his fingers and so forth. Li Keqiang, for example, who was the premier for a while, you know, went out and talked to them sort of face to face. Hu Yaobang went everywhere. He visited almost 2/3 of the 2,300 Xian counties in China during the period when he was Secretary General. He loved to sit around and chat with the peasants. He had advice on what trees that they should plant, but he wanted to listen to them. He wanted them to get industry to help them. I mean, he was a peasant's peasant, a man of the people. And so that is the kind of leader that he was. And afterward, people remembered him. And once his name was taken out of the black box, there were hundreds of articles, thousands of articles, recollecting what a good man he was, how honest he was, how decent and upright he was. His children wrote books about him. And people remembered and they said, well, why can't we have another leader like Hu Yaobang? And that's the question that I'm going to kind of conclude with, because I want to tell you a little story. Xi Jinping doesn't want Chinese people to read this book. And I was telling you about this earlier. When I was reaching my final manuscript in about September of last year, suddenly the Hu Yaobang historical materials information website, which all of the good articles from Yanhuang Chunqiu, what's it? Common Sense.
Oh,
公示网 migrated to Hu Yaobang's website because there was looser control over it. It was because it had Hu Yaobang's name on it. It was sponsored by his son. So all of these good articles, which were very controversial, suddenly disappeared in September. And I thought, well, I've got copies of them and I've already made my quotes. So all I need to do is say, you know, website broken. But in November, it opened up again. And all of the URLs of all the articles that I used were changed. So I went back on that website for basically 10 hours a day for you know, more than a month, getting every one of those new articles, putting them into my manuscript, and sending it on for the galley proofs in April of this year when they closed the website for good. So, if you are interested in seeing some of the stuff that I found inspirational, interesting, historic, it's on my website. I feel like a politician. HTTPS robertsuettinger.com. And the missing websites, web postings are all there. It's about 450 of them. But Xi Jinping does not want you to read it, and I don't think they're done with me yet. I think they're probably going to see if they can break my website. Xi Jinping, interestingly enough, was the guy that rehabilitated Hu Yaobang completely. Well, not quite completely. When he was rehabilitated first in 2005, his biography was brought out in 3 volumes, but only one of them was published. The other 2 were held in reserve for changes that they were demanding that the authors refused to make. His own selected works, Hu Yaobang's selected works, didn't quite come out. So when Xi Jinping rehabilitated him, they had a formal ceremony. The whole Politburo Standing Committee was there. All of the proper pieces were in place. All the right speeches were made, and the books came out. Only problem is they took out several thousand, if not 100,000 characters out of the biographies, and they Baudelarized, I'm sorry, the selected works even more. They're still good and they're still worth reading, but it's very clear that and Xi Jinping also brought out another historical resolution, which basically, you know, threw the rest of them under the bus. And so Hu Yaobang now hardly even gets a mention in Xi Jinping's speeches. And his works have disappeared, his websites are closed. and Hu Yaobang is again silenced. I'm hopeful that I can help to break that silence. So that's my spiel. Questions are more than welcome.
Thank you. That's a good spiel. And somehow your having been in government maybe gives you an ability to see this as a really human process with real people, because the way you tell the story, it's so real. Whereas from the poli-sci point of view, everything is abstract and numbers and nomothetic propositions and causal mechanisms and stuff like that. So it's a good thing that you didn't go on in a PhD.
One of my old colleagues at the agency had a little theory or little slogan that he used. He said, political scientists go into theory because they don't know the facts.
Yeah.
And I tend to agree with that.
I want to encourage the people who are online to put any questions and comments in the Q&A box, and folks in the room as well to raise your hand. But this does make me ask a question I'm always curious about, which is, about how different does the world look inside the classified world from what it looks like to us? Now, I'm not talking about poli-sci, and it's
No.
It's, but just sort of what we know, what the rest of us in the room can perceive and what you can perceive. Because you brought it up. It's not
I'm
about
sure I
your
probably
book.
shouldn't have, but I have had I developed late in my career a reputation for being a very firm supporter of open source intelligence. The agency and all the other intelligence agencies collect information that isn't publicly available. When I was in analytical positions, and people would say, well, what percentage of the material that you use comes from which int, humint or sigint or emint or whatever? And I said, probably 75% of my stuff comes from US or from OSINT, from open source intelligence. I mean, we used to get, the FBIS used to publish a daily booklet with all the newspaper articles and radio broadcasts and so forth of speeches that were given, articles that were read, and it was our Bible. We couldn't have done our job without it. So I always told people whenever they asked, when they were saying, well, what should we spend our money on? And I would always say, get more open source intelligence because we handle it better. Not because it's hard to get, but because we have the more efficient means of processing it. And the people that use it and need it are here in this building. And they said, no, we need some more armpit sniffing satellites or something. And so I always lost. And then, the best job I ever had as a contractor was working for a little boutique that was called Open Source Works. And we had people who were native Chinese speakers. They were citizens of the United States, but they didn't have clearances. And we worked on all open source material. It was the best job I ever had. Because China is not as open as it should be, but it's not as closed as we think it is. If you know where to look, if you look for the historical stuff, if you look for the biographies, look for the gazetteers, look for some of the obscure statistics, you can learn a lot. I mean, 5 years before we discovered that we were worried about Chinese graduate students coming to the United States and studying science and technology and STEM studies, I wrote a paper about it. I said, here's what's happening. Here's where they're going. I wasn't trying to call attention to any criminal activity or anything. I'm just saying, if you want to look at where Chinese graduate students are going, they're going to the United States, Australia, Japan, England, Germany, France, and Australia. I said, they're going other places too, but that's where the bulk of them are going. What are they studying? They're studying S&T. They're studying mathematics. They're studying engineering. They're studying all kinds of things that will help them modernize China. They go back with a lot of money from the government, and this is all in the open source. They go back with a lot of money from the government, and they start up a new laboratory at some of these Class II universities all around the country, Suzhou University, Hangzhou University, and they turn out a lot of very good material lots of patents, lots of practical stuff, and unfortunately, probably a lot of military weapons as well. But you know, where did I got that off open source? I didn't get that out of anything the NSA put out. And I'm not saying that that's the way we can do it all the time, but we shouldn't disregard it.
Not to get off the book, just one more small thing. I think that the Chinese side as well, and maybe other adversaries, excel at using open source information
Sure they do.
to get information about what's going on in the United States. James Mulvannon, among others, has written
Friend of mine.
about that. Okay, we have
Oh,
questions.
I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
Because they have universities, large universities, that have lots of English majors, and they can be put to use translating all this stuff that they acquire, not just open source, but by other means as well. So material that has been spirited away, and there's been a lot of it, by not entirely honorable means, let's say, is much more easily accessed in the PRC than it is for us doing the same thing in China, because there aren't enough Chinese language speakers in the United States that want to work these things. But there are plenty of people that speak English and want to use it to help their government.
Peter,
You started out by saying that you pushed aside.
microphone.
Bob, started out your talk by saying you pushed aside the material that you had written at the agency because you didn't want to come to the conclusions before you had the facts.
Right.
Now that you have the facts, what did you get wrong when you were at the agency?
Well,
And what does that say about the implications of that, if anything?
I think in part because we were relying heavily on open source material, we didn't get that much wrong. We hit the basic facts mostly right, and I think we overemphasized a theory of Chinese politics that was more a Western theory, and we used more Western terminology. Now, in other words, we talked about reformers versus conservatives. We talked about leftists versus rightists. The Chinese talk about that too, but we talked about the system as if it were divided, factionalized along lines that we would recognize as Republicans and Democrats. We didn't say that, obviously, but they were written for a Western audience, and so we tried to put it in terms that would be more readily understandable to them. I think that we did a disservice in that regard. I think we knew that Chen Yun was an important actor, but we didn't know how important. When we saw a change in economic policy, we thought, well, they all just thought that they needed to slow this down or that down. And we didn't realize that it was because Chen Yun had spoken at the Party Congress prior to that decision being made, and his people were now in charge. I mean, that's what Chinese politics is all about, at least in the way that I look at it now. It's about getting your people in the most important jobs. We didn't look at it that way back in those days. We didn't have the tools, and we didn't have the knowledge, and we didn't read the Chinese either. We could have if we'd been a little bit more scrupulous about it, but we had FBIs. It was a crutch. We had the translations on a day-to-day basis, so we were reliant on that, and I don't think we got any of the big issues wrong, but we missed some of the implications. We missed the political struggle that was going on. We knew it was going on, but it was sort of like cats fighting in a bag. We didn't know what, we thought they were issue related. They weren't issue related, they were personal related. They were Deng Xiaoping, who hated Chen Yun hated Peng Zhen hated hated Mao. So I mean, it was the amount of personal and personnel pressure at the top levels of that government. I don't think we fully understood. We thought they were all comrades, and they probably had differences of opinion on issues, but they'd work them out. No, they couldn't work them out. So I think we missed that.
Let me take one from the Q&A here from Jeremy Ademan. Why was Hu rehabilitated in party memory under Xi and not before? when power in the previous, before she was still passed on more fluidly with changing secretary generals. Do you understand that
Yeah.
question?
What's interesting about the system in the period after Hu's death is it was still a very, very rigid system. And you know, from 1989 until 2005, you couldn't find a picture of Hu Yaobang. There was no written rule. There was nobody that was punished or thrown in jail for mentioning Hu's name in public. They just all knew that the party didn't want to talk about Hu Yaobang. And then suddenly, the guy whose magazine, Yan Wang Chunqiu, and his name was Xiao Ke. He was a former general, and he basically said, "All right, we're gonna open this up here. We're gonna have a picture of Hu Yaobang on the inside cover, and a little poem about it. And if anybody gives you any trouble about this, send it to me. Here's my phone number. Tell those people in the propaganda department to come see me." And so that's what started it, and they didn't, and then at that point, Hu Jintao had been an acolyte of a sort of Hu Yaobang's, and he always maintained that, look, Hu Yaobang had nothing to do with Tiananmen. He wasn't marching out there. He wasn't advocating anything. He just was a model that people loved, and they wanted to remember him. We should not continue to hold on to, you know, the legacy of Jiang Zemin and Deng Xiaoping. They're all dead now. So he gradually began to loosen the strictures. At the same time, he refused to attend the first 2005 meeting. He was often, he allowed it to take place on a day that he wasn't going to be there, even though it wasn't actually Hu Yaobang's birthday. And they always kept a careful hand on things. The propaganda department is nothing if not rule bound. And so their other magazines just didn't go along with Yan Wang Chunqiu. The Hu Yaobang website wasn't set up until 2006. It started very slowly, and only with photos of Hu Yaobang's home village and where he slept when he was in labor camp, and some reminiscences and so forth. And it was only a couple of years after that they began to open out, particularly on the question of rehabilitations of old cadres. I think the first book that came out on that was in 1996, and then some more started coming out, and then the big ones started to come out in 2005. And then Xi Jinping got into a bit of a tangle with Hu Yaobang's son about constitutional government. It got nastier, and Hu Yaobang's son went to work for Yan Wang Chunqiu. And Xi Jinping finally said, "That's it for that. We're done." They were, at that point in 2016, of the articles that were submitted to the authorities for publication, 90% were rejected. So they were only able to publish, 10 or 15, 20 articles out of the, 200 or 300 that they may have gotten to review. And these were all old guys. They were all in their 90s. And they were running out of steam, but they weren't running out of fervor. So that closure was ugly, and it had repercussions. And it basically told everybody Xi Jinping is in charge. And he had given a speech, which I quote toward the end of the book, and I'm not sure of its authenticity. It was published in Hong Kong in a magazine that was called, I think, Zhan Xiao or something like that. But it was a speech that I think he gave to the Politburo Standing Committee. I don't know how this guy got it in Hong Kong, and he didn't say. But it rang true to me. It sounded authentic. And one of the things that Xi Jinping said was, there's all kinds of people who want me to reform and go faster. And he said, we've tried that, and it didn't work. It didn't work out. There are too many people who are demanding too much of me. I just can't do it, and I won't do it. So he basically, pulled the plug, and has not gone back. And he continues to shrink the area available for people to talk about political reform in particular. And now even economic reform, the third plenum that took place in June was almost a joke because it really didn't have any reform in it at all. So the term reform, which Hu Yaobang used to personify, is now basically dead. They won't say that, but it is.
See,
I have a simple question. Do you think that, I'm sorry. I have a simple question. Do you think Hu Yaobang, as we say the conscience of the party, his peril is a destiny for him? He didn't have any narrow opportunity to have a happy ending.
To have a high what?
Have a happy ending.
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, when I look at it in retrospect, which is the only way that I can look at it, had Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang been better able to collaborate with each other, yeah, they might have been able to pull it off. I mean, 1985 and 86 were sort of a turnaround. Because in 1983, 84, they had the spiritual pollution campaign. There was all kinds of attacks against Hu and Zhao, but they turned them back. How did they do that? They used the secretariat. They used the people in the ministries to say, well, in economic work, we don't have any spiritual pollution. We don't have any spiritual pollution in science and technology. We don't need to worry about that. And then Hu Yaobang was able to say, well, I'm going to Japan and I don't want any spiritual pollution articles while I'm gone. And so the only people that were pushing it were Hu Qiaomu and Deng Lichun. And they were, Deng Lichun was so eager to have Hu Yaobang's job, it was almost written on his forehead. So it seemed as if they figured out how to use the bureaucracy. How do you put together? I mean, Wu Guoguang has a couple of wonderful books out, and he talks about the paper chase, basically about the importance of doing documents. And at I think it was the 6th plenum of the 12th Central Committee in August and September of 1986, Hu Yaobang and his secretary Zheng Bijian basically ran that like their personal hobby horse, and they brought people in, they rewrote documents, and they gave them to Deng Xiaoping and Chen Yun, who were sort of, I mean, they were limited by their age at this point. Everybody knew it, but at the end, Deng Xiaoping turned on Hu Yaobang and sort of said, "We're going to pursue spiritual pollution until the end," and that sank Hu Yaobang right on the edge of his most complete victory at the 6th plenum. Deng Xiaoping just shot him out of the water. So was it foreordained as long as those old guys were in charge? Yes. I mean, Deng was never good. One of the rumors was that Deng had offered Hu Yaobang to be the chairman of the military commission. And the other rumor, which was slightly different, was that you could be the chairman of the advisory committee. I believe the second one. I never believed the first one. And Deng was not going to give up that job. And Zhao Ziyang didn't want to give up that job. And Hu Jintao didn't want to give up that job. But they had to. So they did.
Question, yeah.
Yeah. I have a question about like the difference between the Jiang Zemin and Hu Yaobang, because you seem like Deng Xiaoping has chosen like Hu Yaobang as the next candidate for the general secretary, but actually after Hu Yaobang, that Jiang Zemin seemed to do better, that he did not get pissed off. And I think that a rumor is that the Jiang Zemin seems to be handled a better relationship with the old man, but Hu Yaobang seems not to. How do you think of this problem?
Every communist party on the planet has had succession problems. The succession problems came to a very sharp end with Hu Yaobang's death, the failure of Zhao Ziyang as general secretary, and the need to replace him. The replacement was Jiang Zemin. Whose candidate was Jiang Zemin? Was he Deng's? He was Chen Yun's and Li Xianyan's. And Deng was in a position, I think most people don't realize, and I write about it sort of circuitously in both books, that Deng was in a weakened position after Tiananmen. His reputation was low. And he wanted, what's the guy's name from Tianjin? Li Ruihuan. Li Ruihuan. He wanted Li Ruihuan to be the general secretary, and Chen Yun and Li Xianyan and others said no. So he could not do it. So what happened then was what was referred to as a skip generation succession, which means that you, Deng Xiaoping, cannot name the next general secretary. We're going to name that person. But you can name the one after that. So Deng Xiaoping named Hu Jintao. Jiang Zemin was not able to name his secretary or his successor because it was already chosen as Hu Jintao, but he could name the next one. Well, who's the next one? Xi Jinping. Now that whole system has been chucked out. Xi Jinping doesn't want anything to do with that, and quite frankly, I don't think anybody did, because they just said that's no fun at all. Where's politics when you can't purge somebody? So I don't know whether Jiang Zemin was a flatterer. I met him a couple of times, and he was. I'm trying to think of the right Chinese term for it. Can't, fortunately. But Hu Jintao was weak. Hu Jintao came out of the Youth League. He surrounded himself with people who were good administrators, who were honest and decent for the most part, who knew how to work with their fellows, who didn't have much by way of military background. So they were out of sync with the norm as succession had developed in the PRC over many years. So I don't know whether it was a matter of who they knew, or we still don't know what the mechanics of this is, but whatever.
So talking about the successor problem, do you think that there's a committee that decide that, or there's just a person that's the secretary to decide that the next person to be the chairman?
We don't, honestly, I don't know what it is. The old guys have always had a voice in it. During Hu Yaobang's tenure, they developed a system within the organization department, and Li Rui writes about this, called the decency, the third echelon. And what they did was to have a recommendation process that started at the provinces and went back up and eliminated people along the line. It was fairly successful, except it was easy to get around. Anybody whose father was anybody in the Central Committee could say, well, I don't like who you got in line for Shandong first secretary. Let's have my son do that job instead. And that's the way it would turn out. So they didn't fix it. They just kind of made it more complicated.
So let me take one from online, from Joanne Lee, who sounds to be a friend of yours.
I think I
looks
know
like.
her, yes.
Bob, congratulations on the book. You titled it Conscience of the Party. Can you please put a handle on how Hu Yaobang is viewed in the populace today? Is he known, revered, or is he essentially a footnote easily erased from the Chinese historical tombs at whim of the political forces who write and rewrite the drafts?
It's pretty, thank you, Joanne. It's a good question. It's pretty hard to tell because what are the means that we have to measure public opinion in China? They're all unreliable. I think the propaganda department does a pretty good job of holding down the number of pro-Hu Yaobang articles that are written. But the ones that have been in circulation are still in circulation, unless they were on the Hu Yaobang website and they've disappeared. My sense is, and it's no more than kind of an impression after having read hundreds of articles about Hu Yaobang. And these are not only from people who worked for him, these are from senior economists, these are from philosophers, professors at the party school, and all the way down to people who saw him when he came out to visit their county in Shanxi province or wherever. And they were struck by his energy, they were struck by his openness, they were struck by his honesty and candor in talking to people. They were struck by the fact that he would rather he didn't like the meals that were served for his benefit at the county government headquarters. He'd rather go out and eat 3 dishes in a soup with some of the peasants in the village. He preferred meeting with people and hearing what they needed, and people remembered that. When he when his funeral cortege left the Great Hall after his funeral, it was mobbed. It's about a 20-minute drive from the Great Hall to the Babaoshan Cemetery. It took more than an hour to get there because they had to keep sending people out in front of the cars and moving them aside. He was genuinely popular. Would they stand up and revolt for him? I wouldn't bet on that. You know, none of his children or any of his secretaries or any of his followers have made it into the top ranks of the CCP. I think they were frightened of him. In fact, and this is just a side note, when Hu Yaobang went down to Hunan province after he'd been purged, several people came down to visit him. And he, when they would start talking, he would put his hand up to his ear like this, which it didn't mean I'm deaf. It means that the walls have ears, so let's go outside and talk. And I think there was probably reason for concern because he was popular. When he walked around this park in Hunan, people mobbed him. They just, what did they want? They wanted to have their pictures taken because they remembered him. And he said, you know, I don't know why they do that. He said, I don't know why they think so highly of me. Because, I mean, in his own view, he was a failure. So I think that memory remains alive. Simply because, you know, Deng Xiaoping is now kind of that guy. Zhao Ziyang is widely disliked. Mao Zedong is hardly mentioned anymore, and Xi Jinping is a guy that everybody loves to hate. So, you know, in many ways, the leader complex is fading, and it's hard to see how Xi Jinping is going to find a successor, which is, you know, is a serious issue, because he basically has burned that bridge behind him. So we don't know how it's going to work out.
I want to ask a question and link it to two questions from the web. So my question is, what did Hu Yaobang believe? What you describe, you know, he had this very turbulent life and so on, but you said he was a great reader and thinker. So was he, everything was for sort of pragmatism that we got to get people back to work and produce agricultural products and whatever it takes? Or was he sort of a reformist that we need to liberalize this system and not have abusive leaders like Mao? Or was he a Marxist with some of the views of some of the Marxists that he sort of liberated, who discussed Marxism in a new way in the Leland Ushu Hui in 1970, whatever it was, 77 or 89. Or, you know, what, did he have a coherent body of thinking?
I honestly don't think he did.
So let me add to this,
Okay.
these guys. So anonymous attendee says, because this relates to it, are there any leaders today who echo Hu Yaobang's message for reform? Because we generally think of him as a reformist, but what does that mean? Were there other historical reformists? Oh, geez, my Zoom keeps turning off and then were there, but anyway, were there other, it's Zoom upgraded, so now it's worse. The other question was whether there are other his people in history of the party. So, you know, was he a reformist, first of all, or is there anybody who thinks like him? Thank you.
Well,
Were
he
there
got
other
it.
historical reformists other than Hu Yaobang with similar weight or influence in Chinese society from the party?
No. On that question, I mean, reform, as I indicated earlier, is one of those words like strategy in English that no longer has any real meaning. And you could call anything reform and you can get away with it, but you don't have to mean it. Hu Yaobang got in his worst trouble in 1983 when he gave a speech that echoed Deng Xiaoping's four modernizations approach, but he said everything has to reform. Reform is an attitude. Reform is not a set of policies. Reform is an attitude that you take toward your work. And that attitude has to be, we're going to do this right. If we make mistakes, we'll fix them. We're not going to throw anybody in jail because they don't agree with us. We're going to let people speak their minds, and we'll debate things before we decide them. And so, I mean, if that is an essential sort of philosophy of reform, he had that. And Hu Qiaomu tried to have him fired literally within 2 months after he made that speech. And so he had to disavow it. He didn't really disavow it, but he had to just sort of, whoa, that ain't gonna work. Was there anybody that pursued reform with the kind of alacrity that Hu Yaobang did? Zhao Ziyang certainly didn't. For Zhao Ziyang, reform was government and party divide, which turned out to be for him a disaster. And the other one was price reform, which also was a disaster. So, I mean, the problem was that nobody really understood it. Nobody really knew what reform meant. And I don't think, Deng Xiaoping called himself the chief architect of reform before I think he ever had any idea what that meant. So it became whatever he wanted. And most of them didn't work. So there is, I think, a dearth of there's a lot of philosophical articles in China that talk about reform. And particularly in the early 2000, there's a lot of stuff that you could find which involve fairly intricate theorizing about reform and how to do it. Hu Yaobang used Marx and Engels as his go-to resources. And I think he probably did that because he wasn't any longer comfortable with Mao. He knew that Lenin was a tyrant, and that Stalin was a brute, and he didn't really think. I mean, I hate to do this, and I apologize. I don't know what Hu Yaobang thought, and I don't want you to think that I know what Hu Yaobang thought. But if I were to guess at his trend of thinking, I would say that he was against dogmatic thinking altogether, whether it was Mao's, Stalin's, whoever. Open your mind, open your head, and let ideas in. If it works, it's right. And he had a campaign, which I didn't mention, but it was this whole campaign about the criterion of truth, which sounds ridiculously obscure to anybody outside of China, but it was extraordinarily important, which was, you can't just come out and wave slogans at me. You can't just shout things at me and say this is truth. Just because Mao said it doesn't mean it was true. You need to be able to prove it in practice. You need to put it into practice, and then if it works, it's truth. And that was it's a very pragmatic attitude, which the Communist Party has always hated. But that was what, and he needed to call for that without calling for it directly.
So we're out of time, but I want to do two more questions. One by you, you had your hand up, and one by me.
Okay.
And my question is, you said Zhao Ziyang at this final meeting when everybody was beating up on Hu, he said, I can't work with the guy, but there's a theory that says that Zhao was out undermining Hu for a long time, and that was really responsible for, do you agree with that theory?
That theory has been out there. I don't necessarily agree with it because the basis is very thin. It's one letter that Zhao wrote in 1984, and it doesn't mention Hu Yaobang.
Okay.
It's very
Okay.
It's not persuasive.
All right, you.
Professor Nick, I think she had her
Hand up first. Okay, all right.
I yield my time to her.
All right, please.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I was born and raised in Hong Kong. I just graduated there this summer. And I've never heard of Hu Yaobang in my life.
Well,
And I just wanted to ask, do you think there's gonna be another big reform for the CCP, or what that means for the rest of the territories? Yeah.
I would have to say I'm not an optimist on that score. I think that the road traveled backward in the last 10 years, 12 years under Xi Jinping has been so thorough, and the atmosphere for even thinking about reform is so squeezed that it's hard for me to see where it will come from. Yet at the same time, there is among Chinese people a desire for something better, for a system that works better, that's organized better, that's more for the people, of the people, by the people, whatever you want to call it. And you see this kind of thinking rear its head every once in a while with the paper revolution or the bicycle revolution or whatever, or certainly in Hong Kong. I mean, look what happened in Hong Kong. Who would have expected that? I don't know how long it will take for that movement to reemerge. I simply don't know. Do I hope for it? Sure. But I don't see it. And the surveillance system, I mean, the public security apparatus in China is overwhelming. It's everywhere. It's now taking over foreign policy. It's taking over. I mean, the whole Politburo Standing Committee now is basically all security thugs. So it's hard to see where that's going to raise its head. And I have no predictions that I would confidently make on that score. Like I say, I'm hopeful, but I'm not confident.
So time is up, so thank you so much, Bob. Great. And if you guys want to still have questions, I think you can surround him as the masses did to Hu Yaobang. It's great.